Hello everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar. Before we begin, we would like to cover a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your audience console are some application widgets you can use. You can expand each widget by clicking on the maximize icon at the top right or by dragging the bottom right corner of the widget panel. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be available one day after the webcast using the same audience link. A copy of today's slide deck and other resources are available in the resource list widget. It's a green file icon at the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions for presenters, click on the Q&A widget at the bottom and submit your question. We will try to address as many questions as possible during the webcast. We do capture all questions. If you have any technical difficulties, please click on the Help widget. It has a question mark icon that covers common technical issues. You can also submit technical issues via the Q&A widget. Now I'd like to pass it over to Dave Wittenberg. Dave, you now have the floor.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon, and welcome to attending this webinar. My name is Dave Wittenberg, and I'll be your moderator. And I'm taking great interest in bond. I've been involved in it since 2009, since the design phase. And the demonstration has been an important experiment to test whether or not disability insurance beneficiaries will work more with a different set of programmatic rules incentives. The demonstration itself, which you're about to hear in a moment, was actually predated by a set of pilots that showed some promise for promoting work for the demonstration. One of the punchlines you'll hear from today's session is that while the impacts from the bond demonstration did not emerge as hoped as primary outcomes, the evaluation itself still provides some very important lessons for both policy and practice. And today's discussion is meant to really tease out what was learned, and we'll talk not only about the evaluation, but the history, the findings, and trying to put those evaluation findings in policy context. And so we have a full lineup for you all today. We're pleased to lead off with Mark Warshawski, who is the Deputy Commissioner for Retirement and Disability Policy from Social Security Administration. And he'll really set the context not only for bond, but for the history that led up to bond. After Mark talks, Daniel Gubitz of Apt Associates will explain the bond demonstration and what it tested and really provide the outline of the design. Next up will be Denise Hoffman from Mathematica, who will share findings about the impact of bond on a nationally representative sample that we call Stage 1. And then Judy Geyer of Apt Associates will share her findings about the impact on those who were most likely to use the benefit offset. Following this summary of the evaluation findings, Dave Stapleton of Mathematica will discuss the lessons from bond and try to put the findings into policy context. And finally, John Jones, who is the current project officer for bond within the Office of Research and Demonstration of Employment Support at SSA, will provide his perspectives from the SSA lens. We will finish today's discussion with questions from the audience. Please submit your questions via the Q&A panel at any time throughout the webinar. And so to get us started, I am pleased to welcome Mark Warshawski to provide an overview of the demonstration. So Mark, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mark Warshawski, and as was mentioned, I'm the Deputy Commissioner for Retirement and Disability Policy at Social Security. As we finish our 9-year rigorous study, I'm proud to present to you the findings of the Benefit Offset National Demonstration, what we call BOND. Before I do, however, I want to briefly describe SSA's current policy for beneficiaries of Social Security Disability Insurance, SSDI, which you may have heard of referred to as the cash cliff. This means that any earnings above the substantial gainful activity or SGA level imposes 100% tax on the beneficiary's monthly benefit payments. In 2018, SGA is $1,180 for non-blind beneficiaries and $1,970 for beneficiaries who are blind. Bond differed from SSA's current policy by testing the replacement of the cash cliff with a ramp or offset. And specifically, it allowed for a $1 reduction in SSDI benefits for every $2 in earnings above SGA. This provided a gradual reduction in benefits as earnings increased and averted the elimination of cash benefits when earnings rose above SGA. In conjunction with this $1 for $2 offset, Bond also tested the effectiveness of enhanced benefits counseling. Bond's goal was to determine whether the benefit offset and the counseling services would help SSDI beneficiaries return to work, as well as determine the associated costs and benefits of this change. And this was measured by the experiment in a very sophisticated and comprehensive manner. So how do we get here? Let me start with the origin of Bond, which is Congress directed SSA to conduct Bond in the Ticket to Work and Work Incentives Improvement Act of 1999. But this had been under discussion for many years before the Ticket Act. Congress was concerned that SSDI beneficiaries were working beneath their abilities because of the SGA requirements. For example, they thought that there was a significant amount of working just below SGA, which is known as parking. They thought there might be quitting a job before earnings crossed the SGA threshold or simply choosing not to work. There was some evidence that suggested that the cash cliff in SGA caused this behavior. Therefore, Congress created Bond, or as it was known back then, the $1 for $2 demonstration, to test the effect of replacing the existing SSDI post-entitlement rules with a $1 offset for every $2 earned above a certain level. Congress made it clear that this demonstration was to test the effects of this offset. So as we got ready to do this, we had and before Bond, there was a 4-state benefit offset pilot demonstration, or BOPD for short. As part of the careful design of a Bond, BOPD was a small information gathering experiment to work out the administrative logistics needed to implement a benefit offset within SSA's operations before rolling out a complete national demonstration. The contract for BOPD was awarded in 2004 for $4 million. BOPD was implemented as a 4 independent randomized controlled experiment in Connecticut, Utah, Vermont, and Wisconsin. Enrollment occurred over a 7-month period beginning in August of 2005 and ending in November of 2006. A total of 1,820 SSDI beneficiaries were randomized almost evenly between one treatment group and one control group. Subjects in the treatment group had 6 years to use the $1 for $2 benefit offset. The results from combining the 4 states showed that the benefit offset caused an increase in the percentage of beneficiaries with earnings above SGA, which did indeed suggest that the cash lift in the SSDI program acts as a disincentive to work. High-earning individuals, defined as those having earnings greater than SGA before the random assignment, were caused to reduce their earnings, and low-earning individuals, defined as those having earnings below SGA at random assignment, were caused to increase their earnings above SGA. While interesting, these results were not sufficiently conclusive and could not be generalized to the full population of SSDI beneficiaries. Unlike BOPD, however, Bond provides a broader interpretation for national policy making. So Bond is a larger demonstration, much larger, cost $127 million, involved 1.2 million beneficiaries randomly selected from 10 sites around the country to form 2 experiments. Stage 1 involved a larger, mandatory, nationally representative sample that tested the benefit offset with regular counseling services, and these are the services that are currently offered to beneficiaries. We will hear more about this stage and this experiment in today's second presentation. Stage 2, conversely, involved a smaller, voluntary sample used to test the benefit offset in conjunction with enhanced benefit counseling. In doing so, it tested the effectiveness of enhanced counseling while also establishing an upper bound on the potential of Bond. So again, there are two stages. One is large and was mandatory, and it was really focused on the effect of the 1 for 2 per se. And the second one was smaller, and it was voluntary, and it was really focused on the effect of enhanced counseling. We'll hear more about the second stage in today's third presentation. Overall, BOND produced surprising results and lessons learned for policy, which you'll hear about in more detail in today's fourth presentation. We will also discuss how BOND helped SSA improve program administration. So before we get started with these presentations and discussion, I want to briefly just explain why demonstrations are so important. It is because, as randomized controlled trials, they are an invaluable means of determining the effect of social programs and policies. As in the clinical trial research industry, rigorous, randomized controlled trials are used by the federal government to protect the public. For example, the FDA prevents the legal sale of drugs that fail to show significant evidence of safety and efficacy. That same principle applies for public policy experiments such as BOND. We make policy decisions based on evidence obtained from demonstrations such as BOND. And that's both in a positive and in a negative way. In other words, it may indicate that we should pursue a particular policy or not pursue a policy. Indeed, as part of government's move toward evidence-based decision-making that started in the 1980s, randomized treatment control experiments, or demonstrations, have become one of the accepted mechanisms of showing the effectiveness of proposed public policies before they become law. Now, certainly other analytical methods can be useful in various circumstances and are, of course, cheaper. But well-designed demonstrations give a high degree of confidence in the results, and sometimes, and it really depends on the circumstances, they're the only way to know for sure if certain policies will work. The problem with analytical methods sometimes is they depend on a lot of assumptions, and depending on how comfortable we are with those assumptions, we are therefore less comfortable with the results. But demonstrations give us a very high degree of confidence. In this context, BOND's findings provide our policymakers with evidence on benefits and costs to judge whether implementing a national $1 for $2 benefit offset is in the best interest of SSDI beneficiaries, the Social Security Administration, and the taxpayers. So on behalf of SSA, I hope you find today's webinar interesting and informative, and I would like to thank you for participating.
Thank you, Mark. Good afternoon. My name is Danny Gubitz. I'm from Apt Associates. I'm going to be talking to you about the design of BOND. I'm going to give a brief policy background. Mark already covered some of the main points. And then I'm going to describe how the $1 for $2 benefit offset tested in BOND differs from current DI rules. And then I will describe the central questions of the BOND evaluation. Some DI beneficiaries can return to substantial work in the absence of medical recovery. But current program rules discourage beneficiaries from engaging in SGA. Interest in letting beneficiaries earn more and keep part of their benefits dates back to 1980 at least. Both an earned income exclusion and a 50% benefit reduction rate for earnings above a threshold were incorporated into the Supplemental Security Income, or SSI, program at its creation in the early to mid-1970s. In 1999, Congress authorized BOND in the Ticket to Work and Work Incentives Improvement Act, and Congress asked SSA to test the costs and benefits of a $1 for $2 benefit offset on earnings above the SGA threshold. Congress also specified that SSA should develop nationally representative estimates of the impacts of this policy on earnings and on DI benefits. And BOND is part of SSA's broad initiative to identify and test policies to help DI beneficiaries increase earnings and reduce reliance on DI. Some of the interest in a benefit offset policy is because of the long-term financial outlook for the DI trust fund. In 1999, the actuaries projected the DI trust fund would be depleted in 2020. The projected depletion date varies based on economic conditions and other factors. In 2012, as a result of the Great Recession, the depletion date was projected to occur as soon as 2016. Since then, the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2015, the economic recovery, and other circumstances have now pushed the projected depletion date to 2032. As Mark said, the Benefit Offset Pilot Demonstration, or BOPD, tested procedures to administer a $1 for $2 benefit offset policy in 4 states. SSA took some lessons from the pilot for how to carry out the national demonstration. This slide shows the current rules for how earnings affect DI benefits. For monthly earnings up until the substantial gainful activity threshold, which is $1,180 in 2018 for non-blind beneficiaries, that's per month, up to that amount, full DI benefits are paid. At earnings amounts above the SGA threshold, DI benefits drop all the way to 0. This is the cash cliff. Under the benefit offset rules, partial benefits are paid at earnings amounts that are above the SGA threshold. The ramp on the right side of this diagram shows how benefits are reduced by $1 for each $2 in earnings above the SGA threshold. This table takes a number of different earnings levels and puts the information in the previous 2 diagrams together. And this table shows earnings, benefits, and total income for a beneficiary who is entitled to $1,200 of DI benefits per month. The third row of this table is where we first see the difference between current law and offset rules. Here the beneficiary is earning $1,190 per month, just $10 more than the SGA threshold. Under current law, benefits fall to 0 because earnings exceed the SGA threshold. This is the cliff. Under the benefit offset rules, something very different happens. Benefits are reduced by just $5. The $5 amount comes about because earnings exceed the SGA threshold by $10. Since benefits are reduced by half the amount that earnings exceed the threshold, benefits are reduced by half of $10, or $5. The fourth row at earnings of $2,380 per month shows what happens as earnings are halfway down the ramp. The beneficiary receives half of their benefits. And then the last row at earnings of $3,580 per month shows the end of the ramp, also called full offset. Here, earnings are $2,400 over the SGA threshold, so benefits have been reduced all the way to 0. Now, economic theory does not provide a clear prediction for the effects of the benefit offset on earnings and DI benefits for all beneficiaries. The predicted effects of the benefit offset depend on what beneficiaries would earn when subject to current law rules. And here I'll introduce an acronym, BYA, which stands for Bond Yearly Amount. The bond yearly amount is simply 12 times the monthly SGA threshold. The impact of the benefit offset derives from the likely behavior of 2 groups. And the first group is those who under current law would work either not at all or who would work but have earnings below BYA. On average, their earnings should increase either by moving from no employment to employment or moving from earnings below BYA to earnings above BYA. And on average, there should be some benefit savings from this group, as some in this group move from full benefits to partial benefits. The second group is those who under current law would earn above BYA. They are expected to earn less because of the offset, but still above BYA. And for this group, there will be some benefit costs, as beneficiaries move from 0 benefits to partial benefits. And these theorized effects, they go in opposite directions, so the effects for all beneficiaries combined do not have clear theoretically expected directions. We knew that some beneficiaries would earn below BYA and some above BYA in current law, but we didn't know how many, and we didn't know how their behavior might change with the benefit offset policy. So we needed an empirical study of what happens under the 2 policies to determine what total effects are. SSA conducted bond in 2 stages, as Mark said, to answer questions about the effects of the offset on earnings and DI benefits for a national sample and a sample of beneficiaries considered most likely to use the offset. The evaluation set out to answer other questions as well, such as what are the effects of adding enhanced work incentives counseling? Are there different effects by subgroup? What are the costs and benefits of the offset policy compared to current law? And the evaluation also had process and participation questions, such as, was the demonstration implemented as planned, and how many beneficiaries used the benefit offset? In order to provide nationally representative results for the full SSDI caseload, bond was implemented in 10 sites, which are each served by a single SSA area office. These 10 sites were chosen at random. Disabled workers plus disabled adult children and those receiving disabled widow or widower benefits were included in the demonstration. In addition, beneficiaries concurrently receiving SSI and DI were included in stage 1 of the demonstration. Beneficiaries of ages 20 to 59 in May 2011 were eligible for the demonstration, and the top age was 59 because the evaluation did not want beneficiaries to reach full retirement age during the follow-up period, which ended in 2015. Denise Hoffman and Judy Geyer will describe random assignment of beneficiaries in stage 1 and stage 2 in their presentations. Now I will turn it over to Denise. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you for providing that helpful background information, Danny. My name is Denise Hoffman with Mathematica, and now we're going to shift gears and focus specifically on stage 1 of bonds. I'll begin by explaining what exactly stage 1 is and describing its implementation. Next, I'll provide information on beneficiary understanding of and participation in bond. Then I'll describe the impacts of bond on earnings and DI benefit outcomes and present information on the collective costs and benefits of bond. As we've heard, bond was implemented in 2 stages, and the goal of stage 1 is to determine what the impacts of offering the bond offset to all DI beneficiaries would be. So, as Mark mentioned, the idea is to predict, using this large sample, what would happen if bond were to become national law. And we do this by following several steps, which I'll summarize. First, we select a nationally representative sample, which was done by randomly selecting 10 bond sites, as Danny showed in his last slide. Then, within those sites, the bond implementation contractor randomly assigned beneficiaries who met certain criteria to a treatment and a control group. Next, the implementation contractor informed the treatment group members of their assignment to the bond treatment group. Both treatment and control group subjects were offered standard work incentive counseling to help them understand the rules that apply to them. Finally, we compared the outcomes across the treatment and control groups and attribute differences to the effect of bond. The next slide describes random assignment in a bit more detail. As mentioned, the first step was to identify beneficiaries who lived in one of the 10 bond sites and met certain eligibility criteria. There were 1.2 million such beneficiaries. In May 2011, those beneficiaries were randomly assigned to a stage 1 treatment group, a stage 1 control group, or reserved for potential participation in stage 2, which will be the topic of the next presentation. But focusing on stage 1, we can see that the sample sizes are quite large. There were over 77,000 stage 1 treatment subjects and almost 900,000 stage 1 control subjects. The sample size is large because few DI beneficiaries work, and only a small fraction were expected to have earnings high enough to use the offset. So the sample had to be large in order for us to be able to detect any differences between the treatment and control group. I also want to note that the characteristics of the stage 1 treatment and control subjects were essentially the same, and this helps us to attribute differences in the treatment and control group subjects to the effect of bond. Stage 1, as we've heard, involved random assignment without consent, so there needed to be outreach to inform the stage 1 treatment subjects of their assignment to the bond treatment group. And this happened in 2 ways. First, within 4 months of random assignment, all stage 1 treatment subjects received 2 letters to notify them of their assignment to the bond rules. Second, between 1 to 3 years later, those who had not been in contact with the demonstration received an additional letter and up to 2 call attempts. Stage 1 control subjects, on the other hand, were not notified of their involvement in bond because nothing changed for this group. They were still subject to the same rules and procedures, and so contacting them could have led to some confusion. Even with the outreach, relatively few stage 1 treatment subjects had a correct understanding of the benefit rules that applied to them. 3 years after random assignment, about half as many stage 1 treatment subjects understood their rules as did stage 1 control subjects. This is important because in order for treatment subjects to change their work behavior, they need to understand that the offset makes work more attractive. So the relatively limited understanding among stage 1 treatment subjects raises concern that the stage 1 impacts may be muted relative to what they would have been if there was a higher level of understanding. Treatment subjects are considered to have used the offset if their earnings exceed the bond yearly amount, or BYA. However, in most cases, SSA did not apply the bond offset rules to benefits simultaneously. This is because beneficiaries rarely report earnings timely as they are required to do so, and there are also delays in SSA processing the earnings information. So instead, there is a median of 22 months between the first month of offset use and when SSA retroactively adjusted benefits using the 1-for-2 offset formula. And this delay could further obscure beneficiary understanding of how earnings affect benefits. As expected, offset participation was relatively low but increased over time. In the first year the offset was available, 1.1% of stage 1 treatment subjects used the offset. By 2015, offset use had doubled to 2.2%. This growth could be related to several factors, including increased awareness of the offset due to beneficiary outreach, beneficiaries completing milestones leading up to offset use, and the improving economy, which created more job opportunities. Across the entire 5-year period, 3.6% had used the offset in 1 or more months. Now I'm going to present impact results that compare outcomes for stage 1 treatment and stage 1 control subjects over the entire 5-year period, starting with earnings. We do not see a statistically significant impact of the bond offset on total earnings. Over the 5-year period, earnings were virtually the same, and as mentioned, the difference was not statistically significant. We also tested impacts among 7 different subgroups, including those based on the duration of DI benefit receipt, receipt of supplemental security income, baseline employment status, access to the Medicaid buy-in, age, and several groupings based on primary impairment. And among these subgroups, all 7 of them, we did not see any statistically significant impacts on total earnings. Although we were most interested in total earnings, we also estimated impacts on other earnings-related outcomes. And we see that the offset does cause, for example, a small increase in the proportion employed in the period. There's a 0.4% increase, and also a 0.4% increase in the proportion earning above the bond yearly amount in at least 1 year. At the other end of the earnings spectrum, we saw a statistically significant decrease in the proportion earning above 3 times BYA in at least 1 year. So although there are statistically significant differences, we conclude that because these impacts are small and in opposite directions, that they are not substantively important, and that the main takeaway is that there is no increase in total earnings. Turning to DI receipt, we do see a positive and statistically significant increase in DI benefits in the analysis period. The bond offset caused a $665 increase in DI benefits among the stage 1 treatment group, and this equates to an average of $143 per year increase, or about a 1% increase over the control group mean. To summarize the impact results, there was no effective earnings and an increase in DI benefits. Thinking back to the theory in Danny's presentation, we see that the offset did not cause enough stage 1 treatment subjects who would earn below SGA under current law to increase earnings and counteract the windfall to stage 1 treatment subjects who would have engaged in SGA under current law. We did some calculations and determined that the impact of bond on the proportion earning above the bond yearly amount would have to be at least 30 times larger to avoid an increase in DI benefits. So even though stage 1 treatment group understanding the bond rules was relatively low, it seems unlikely that better understanding would change these results in a meaningful way. Finally, we conducted a benefit cost analysis to understand the full cost of bond to all of society. Projecting costs over a 10-year period, we found that beneficiaries gained because of the increase in their DI benefits. We also see a decline in the DI trust fund to cover the increased payments to DI beneficiaries, plus some administrative costs. However, collectively, we see that all society experienced a loss largely because of the increased taxes needed to fund the bond offset. So in total, the results point to a net cost of bond. Thank you, and now I'm going to turn it over to Judy Geyer, who will discuss stage 2.
Thank you, Denise. This is Judy Geyer from Abt Associates, and I'll present on the estimated impacts for motivated volunteers whom we studied in bond stage 2. A lot of what I'm about to show you is similar to what you learned in Denise's presentation. The levels of employment and earnings are higher among stage 2 participants, but we have many of the same conclusions about the offset rules. First, I'll discuss the design of bond stage 2, in particular its purpose, our approach to achieving that purpose, the differences between the stage 2 volunteers and the national beneficiary population represented in the stage 1 sample. I'll describe what enhanced work incentives counseling was that was tested in stage 2. And then I'll present statistics on understanding of the offset rules and offset use, that is, the percentage who had earnings high enough to get an offset payment instead of no benefit. And then I'll present the impacts on earnings and benefit outcomes. The first purpose of stage 2 is to determine the impacts of the benefit offset rules on earnings and well-being of beneficiaries most likely to have earnings high enough to trigger partial benefits under the bond rules. The second purpose is to determine the extent to which enhanced work incentives counseling affects impacts. Instead of reading the bullets about the approach, I'm going to show you the illustration on the next slide. So first, how are we going to find folks most likely to have high enough earnings to trigger benefit reduction under the bond rules? Well, the demonstration randomly selected 238,070 beneficiaries to be solicited for stage 2. Unlike in stage 1, stage 2 had an additional eligibility criterion, which is that the solicitation pool excluded those concurrently receiving SSI. It did so because SSI rules dampen the expected effect of the benefit offset rules compared to current law. The demonstration sent beneficiaries 2 or 3 letters informing them of their opportunity to volunteer. If beneficiaries did not call in as a result of the letters, demonstration staff made up to 3 calls attempting to reach the beneficiary. Out of that effort, 5.5%, or roughly 13,000, volunteered. Volunteers were randomly assigned to 2 treatment groups and a control group. The first treatment group was subject to the offset rules, as in stage 1, and standard work incentives counseling, or WIC. So that treatment is the same as what was given in the stage 1 treatment group. The second treatment group was subject to the offset rules, as described in stage 1, and enhanced work incentives counseling, or EWIC. And then there was the control group. So as a result of this design, how did the stage 2 subjects differ from stage 1 subjects? Well, across the 2 stages, subjects were generally similar in age and impairment types, but there is a striking difference to see. So let's look at the stage 2 control group and compare it to the stage 1 control group. Looking over the whole follow-up periods, which is 5 years for stage 1 and 4 years for stage 2, we can see that the stage 2 volunteers are quite a bit more predisposed to be working, as intended by the design of recruiting volunteers. Stage 1 control group had 22% with any employment over the stage 1 study period. But for the stage 2 control group, it's more than double that, with 52% who had any employment over the stage 2 study period. Likewise, the stage 1 control group had just 5% with at least a year of earnings above the BYA amount. For the stage 2 control group, that percentage was more than 3 times greater, at 16%. So the evaluation was successful at finding folks predisposed to have earnings above SGA. Let me describe the design of enhanced counseling. In the standard model, work incentives counseling is demand-driven, so a DI beneficiary needs to request counseling services. But EWIC, or enhanced counseling, involved direct outreach to beneficiaries. For at least the first 18 months of the study, EWIC counselors called beneficiaries once a month, and after that, quarterly. During those outreach attempts, the enhanced work incentives counselors offered both standard counseling services and also extra services in the form of assessments to help beneficiaries articulate barriers they face in seeking employment, needs they have to maintain employment, and skills they possess that are relevant to certain occupations. With those assessment outcomes, the enhanced work incentive counselors worked with the beneficiary to form employment services plans, which spelled out particular recommendations relevant to the beneficiary's barriers, needs, and skills. I want to be sure to point out that the enhanced work incentive counselors did not provide employment services themselves, but rather made referrals to other or outside employment services and monitored the beneficiary's follow-up of those referrals. The evaluation team concludes that enhanced counseling was implemented as designed. 96% of those randomized to the Offset plus EWIC group received counseling during the study. 92% of those in that group that had a documented need received service coordination, and 64% received a referral to employment services. I won't read the proportions of who received particular one-time services, but you'll note that these proportions are high and a large majority received many of these service types. By contrast, 38% of those randomized to the Offset and Standard Counseling group ever received counseling during the Stage 2 period, and that counseling did not include several of the EWIC-specific services, in particular the assessments in the Employment Services Plan. So, how did counseling affect understanding of the Offset rules? Well, EWIC did increase understanding of the Offset rules. 52% of beneficiaries with enhanced counseling had a correct understanding of the benefit offset rules, compared to 48% in the Offset plus Standard Counseling group. This improvement is statistically significant, but modest. Given that counseling outreach was so high, what should we make of the fact that only 52% had a correct understanding of the rules that apply to them? Is it just that the bond rules are complicated? I mean, what sort of level of understanding could we hope for? Well, let's look at the control group. The Stage 2 control group in gray had only 54% who had a correct understanding of the benefit offset rules that apply to them. So as it turns out, current law itself is pretty complicated. That rate of understanding in the Stage 2 control group, 54%, is the same rate of understanding of those in the national population of DI beneficiaries represented in the Stage 1 control group. So one conjecture is that it's plausible that enhanced counseling moved understanding very close to a level that would be achieved in national adaptation of the bond benefit offset rules. Okay, let's look at statistics on offset use. That is the proportion who had earnings high enough to trigger partial benefits under the bond rules. Let's compare Stage 1 in red with the two treatment groups in Stage 2, the various shades of blue. As you can see, the portion of Stage 2 treatment subjects who had earnings high enough to trigger partial benefits is higher in every year than the proportion of Stage 1 treatment subjects. Looking at the last set of bars on the right, we see that over the course of the demonstration, 15% of Stage 2 earned high enough to have their benefits partially offset, compared to 3.5% in Stage 1. The second thing I'd like you to note in this graph is the height of the blue bars. As it turns out, enhanced counseling, in lighter blue, had no impact on offset use compared to standard counseling, in the darker blue. Let's move to the main findings. Similar to Stage 1, Stage 2 found no evidence that the offset increases earnings. The levels of earnings are higher in Stage 2 than in Stage 1, at about $18,000 over 4 years for treatment group subjects, but we don't detect differences between any of the experimental groups. Let's look at this a bit more deeply by examining some other earnings-related outcomes. We find that the offset paired with either standard counseling or enhanced counseling increases employment and the proportion with earnings above BYA during at least 1 year of the demonstration. These impacts are statistically significant, but modest. Modest in that, just like in Stage 1, they were not large enough to generate earnings impacts. Also, there was no impact of enhanced counseling versus work incentives counseling on employment or the proportion with earnings above BYA. Next, let's look at benefits. Similar to stage 1, we find that the offset increases average total DI benefits due over the study period. This increase is roughly $1,800 to $1,900 over 4 years, which is about $460 a year. Again, we find no statistically significant impact of enhanced counseling versus standard counseling. So I'd like to summarize. Just as in stage 1, we detected no effects on total earnings, and we found an increase in DI benefits. Still, at the same time, more treatment subjects in stage 2 earned above the SGA threshold than treatment subjects in stage 1. So what's behind the increase in DI benefits in stage 2? Well, it's the same story as in stage 1. The levels are higher, but there's an imbalance between the two types of folks affected by the offset rules. The left side of the scale shows the influence of the treatment subjects who were induced to earn above the SGA threshold due to the bond rules, and thus had lower DI benefits as a result of bond. Although this proportion in stage 2 is larger than the proportion in stage 1, this group trying to tip the left side of the scale still isn't as large and influential as the right-hand side, which is also larger in stage 2. These are the beneficiaries who, because of bond, had higher total DI benefits due to the fact that they would have engaged in SGA under current law anyhow, so they just got a DI benefit windfall. Summarizing the effect of enhanced counseling versus standard counseling, there were no impacts of enhanced counseling on earnings or benefits compared to standard counseling, despite the fact that elements of counseling were 3 to 10 times more prevalent. Therefore, the evaluation team concludes that additional contact, assessments, and referrals alone are not likely to lead to higher earnings or earnings exceeding substantial gainful activity. Counseling costs for enhanced counseling, as you would expect, exceed those costs of standard counseling. The difference in cost is roughly $600 per year per beneficiary, so the benefits of enhanced counseling do not outweigh the costs. That was stage 2. Thank you very much, and I'll turn it over to Dave Stapleton.
Helps to unmute. All right. Thank you, Judy. So I've been involved in bond since, I believe, 2006 when I first started doing some work on the design. And so they're leaving it to me to try to put all of these findings in some sort of context and draw lessons from bond, of which there are many, and I will only be able to touch on them. So first I will look at the main findings in context. And then second, I'm going to ask the question, why were the impacts on earnings not larger, and give you some incomplete answers to that, but I think informative. And then finally, I wanted to look at the lessons that the bond demonstration has provided for research on earnings and disability benefits more broadly, and especially in the near future. So there's been a long-term interest in the 1-for-2 benefit offset above the SGA level, and that has been attributed to, as I think previous speakers have described, to the low earnings and income among beneficiary households that make it difficult for them to live well, and also the projected shortfall of the DI trust fund now in 2032, but before 2015 it was much earlier. And the question arose with whether we could replace the cash cliff with a bond ramp, and would it actually increase earnings and income, and would it do so by enough, but increase earnings enough to actually reduce trust fund expenditures? So we now have a long-awaited answer, and that answer is just no. The benefit reductions because of higher earnings are not large enough to offset the windfall gains in benefits that are paid to those who would have given up their benefits to go back to work in the first place. Now, there's a lot more to say to that. It's really important, for instance, to consider whether addressing some of the implementation issues that bond encountered would have led to stronger, more positive impacts on earnings. Denise mentioned that the initial outreach efforts for stage 1 generated lower than expected response. Extensive follow-up efforts generated more response, but it remains possible that some people, some beneficiaries who could work, did not understand or did not trust the opportunity to use the offset. One cause for concern is that so many offset users did not take advantage of the earnings reporting mechanism that was created by the demonstration for their benefit. Did they know that they were actually using the offset when they started using it before they made adjustments to their benefits? Denise also mentioned the long delays in benefit adjustment. Based on findings from behavioral science, it seems likely that when adjustments benefits under experimental rules, the bond rules, are that far out of sync with the rules themselves that beneficiaries may behave quite differently than when the adjustments occur much more quickly as intended. So it is at least plausible that improvements in implementation would have increased earnings impacts. But by how much? In fact, we find that it's really not plausible that they would have been increased by enough to reach what we call the break-even point. That is the point where benefits under the offset would be the same as they are under current law. So consider this table, which summarizes the finding that Denise and Judy have already presented. It shows that for stage 1, we found that the offset increased the percentage of T1 subjects who had earnings above BYA in 2015 by 0.2 percentage points. And this was the largest impact over the 5-year period. And it also shows that, so that's the top left-hand number there. Right under that number is the number 6.2. Well, that's the break-even number. That's how large this increase would have to have been in order for the effect on benefits to be 0. And that's 31 times as large as the actual value. It strains credulity to think that any fixes to implementation could have made such a large difference in the impact on earnings above SGA. And part of the reason it strains credulity is because of what happened in stage 2, where here outreach is not an issue. These people we did successfully reach in the demonstration, and we did find larger impacts as expected, 2.6 for offset plus WIC and 2.7 percentage points for offset plus EWIC. But again, we find that the break-even earnings impacts for this particular outcome would have had been much larger, on the order of 10 times larger for either of the two-stage true groups, in order to have a break-even effect on earnings. So it's not the outreach alone that mattered. There must be something else going on. We also should point out again that the stage 2 EWIC group had the advantage of the enhanced counseling. People were talking to them a lot about using the offset. So they had every reason to understand what was going on, and they did not use it so much that their use was still well below the level that would have yielded the break-even outcome. So it seems really unlikely. It seems that impacts on earnings would have been larger, but it really seems unlikely that they would have been large enough to reach the break-even point. So why else might the earnings impacts not have been larger? Well, the first and most obvious reason is the limited earnings capacity of beneficiaries. In order to get into SSDI in the first place, they had to have medical conditions that were so significant that the SSA determined they were unable to engage in SGA. In other words, unable to earn above the BYA amount on an annual basis. And so they had a history of not being able to work. Many of them were out of the labor force for many years before they had the opportunity to use the benefit offset, so they probably lost skills that they might have had when they first started, lost connection to employers, etc. And even though they might have learned how to learn with their functional limitations or their impairments and recovered to the point functionally that they could work, it would have been maybe very difficult for them, most of them, to do so. So that's one obvious reason, but it's not the only reason. A second one is that if you think about it, the incentive to earn more than the BYA amount under the benefit offset is still not a very strong incentive. It's certainly much better than the incentive under the current law, where you lose all of your benefits once you're past that cash cliff. But it also amounts to an implicit tax of 50% on every $2 earned above above the BYA amount, you lose $1 in benefits. And I think if you think about your own behavior and whether you would respond to something like this when you have a 50% tax rate on top of any other taxes that might apply, you can see that you might be discouraged from doing so. Another point is the complexity of the earnings rules, which I think Judy's done a good job of emphasizing here. And it's really important to note that both the current law rules and the bond rules are quite complex. And if anything, the bond rules add a new complexity on top of already complex rules. And it seems quite likely that that's a reason why beneficiaries did not understand better what the new rules were and how they were different from the old rules. And if they didn't understand it, then how could we expect them to change their behavior as a result? So we think that reason is potentially very important, but it's inherent in both the new rules and the rules that were being tested. And finally are the implementation challenges, which I have already mentioned. And we do think that these could have reduced earnings impacts by some amount, but ultimately it seems like these first three reasons are the major reasons why the earnings impacts were not larger than they actually were. I want to talk very briefly about something called induced entry. Some of you will already be familiar with induced entry. There's been a long-standing concern that the bonds benefit offset would increase applications and awards for DI, and the reason for that is that replacement of the benefit cliff with the offset ramp makes DI a more attractive option financially to those who would have substantial work capacity, even though they have very significant impairments. So after a long investigation and consultation with experts, SSA determined that estimation of induced entry via the bond demonstration was not feasible. Instead, there were several efforts to pursue non-experimental analyses of induced entry, and those produced some estimates that were positive, but not very robust to a number of assumptions that were being made. The important point here is fairly simple. It's that induced entry is not what's behind our estimates. We've assumed no induced entry. We haven't tried to estimate that at all. We took beneficiaries who were already on the rolls, and so we're getting positive impacts for other reasons, not because of induced entry. If there is induced entry, it would add to the positive impacts that we've found. Okay, well now I want to turn to the lessons for research on earnings and the DI program. And there are numerous lessons. Some of these lessons are already incorporated in the Promoting Opportunity demonstration. They were informed by early results from bond. That demonstration is already underway. It was authorized in the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2015, and a number of changes in the rules there reflect what we had learned early in bond. So under the Promoting Opportunity demonstration, there are several rules that make it more likely that benefits will decline rather than go up. First of all, the 1-for-2 offset starts at a lower level of earnings. Also, the trial work period and the grace periods, these periods where beneficiaries now can keep their benefits no matter how much they earn, they go away, and so that would result in benefit savings as well. And finally, there are pretty significant limits on the use of impairment-related work expenses to offset earnings in determining the effect on your benefits, and those were not in place in the Benefit Offset National Demonstration. So all of those things are likely to reduce the benefits received by beneficiaries under the POD 1-for-2 offset. I think as important and maybe more important is the simplifications that these imply. Getting rid of the trial work period and the grace period simplified the rules under POD, get rid of the work CDRs or work reviews that were a major cause of delays in benefit adjustments under bond. Also, POD enlists state and local agencies, vocational rehabilitation agencies, and also WIPA grantees to help the beneficiaries report their earnings on a monthly basis and ensure that benefit adjustments are more timely. So those lessons were learned the hard way from Bond and also BOPT, and I think will really benefit the pod demonstration. There are additional lessons going forward for SSA demonstrations and also for demonstrations outside of SSA. SSA has come up with the idea of conducting what they call the DI Ultimate Demonstration. This is written up in the annual report of SSA to Congress, the most recent version of that. But the goal of this is to find out what the earnings capacity of DI beneficiary is when they can keep all of their benefits regardless of how much they earn, right? So that there isn't any additional tax for earnings, implied tax, implicit tax for earnings above some sort of a threshold. And it's not that SSA intends to make this the new design for our DI benefits, but rather there is a clear need to find out just how much beneficiaries can in fact work under any sort of design. If we could figure that out, then we could figure maybe the best design that would approach that amount and also be compatible with the fiscal health of the DI program. So that's something that may go forward, and I think we've learned a lot from the bond evaluation that will be affecting how SSA actually implements that demonstration. For instance, on outreach, they really need to make sure that those who get the ultimate rule understand what the rule is and are able to take advantage of it and don't see reductions in their benefits when they shouldn't be seeing reductions in their benefits. I think another important lesson from Bond was that it reinforced a lot of prior thinking that maybe what was necessary in order to reduce the number of beneficiaries by helping workers with medical problems earn more was to do that before they get into DI program in the first place. And as has already been mentioned, there are multiple reasons to think that once people are on DI, it's much harder for them to get back to work than if we could help them stay and work in the first place. And the government is undertaking a pretty substantial effort to try to do that, most notably through the RETAIN demonstration, Retaining Employment and Talent After Injury Illness Network. This is a grant program under the Department of Labor. 8 states have been selected to initiate efforts to help workers who are experiencing medical problems to stay in the labor force when they first experience those problems. And the real question here is, can workers with significant medical problems be diverted from applying for DI via work support initiatives? We think in general they'll be better off if they can manage to stay in the workforce. But the question is whether these interventions that will be tested can actually succeed. There's also federal support for other initiatives to help people with disabilities enter or stay in the workforce before seeking disability benefits. And I'm not familiar with all of them, but some of them are targeting younger beneficiaries, younger people with disabilities who do not have significant work histories or who have been older people who have been out of the labor force for some time already. There are also a number of methodological lessons to be learned, and I think these are maybe a little bit more tedious, but really, really important. And one of them has to do with addressing the limitations of using informed volunteers in a demonstration, which we learned quite a lot about from Bond because Stage 2 used informed volunteers, whereas Stage 1 did not. And by comparing the findings for Stage 1 and Stage 2, we could infer how many of those people who were eligible for Stage 2 who actually would have used the offset among those who actually didn't volunteer. So the volunteer rate for Stage 2 was 5.4%, as Judy already said. And when we do this comparison of findings, we find that 20% of the SSDI-only treatment subjects who used the offset in Stage 1 would have volunteered for stage 2 if they had been solicited for stage 2. Only 20%. In other words, 80% of those who were in stage 1 who used the offset in stage 1 would never have volunteered for stage 2. So that's really surprising, especially because of the highly favorable nature of the bond offset. Right? The bond offset, the way it's structured, it's going to hold beneficiaries harmless. They can't be worse off under the offset than they are under current law. So it raises concerns about what we can infer about a national policy from volunteers who may poorly represent those who would be affected by a rules change. The limited under the earnings rules among the volunteers in all groups, which Judy talked about, it's possible that stems from confusion about their assignment status that came through was the result of the recruitment and informed consent and then the random assignment process. But we really just don't know. So the other point that we think is very important methodologically concerning administering experimental rules, how important it is to get them. And as we've said, we did run into problems under bond. And it's really important that the treatment subjects understand what the rules are, because you can't induce them to change their behavior if they don't understand the rules. Experimental rule complexity can hinder that, and we've already pointed to the value of making the rules simpler as under POD. But we also want to point out that it's really important, no matter what the rules are, that demonstrations have sufficient resources to actually implement the rules quickly and as intended. And that wasn't the case early on in bond. That partly stems from the recession and the requirement that SSA, or not the requirement, but the fact that SSA was faced with thousands and thousands of new applicants for SSDI that they didn't have the resources to address. So closing up, what I see as the main lessons from bond is that we provided a definitive answer to a really important policy question, that this particular offset is not going to increase earnings to the point where actually it generates benefit savings or even results in benefit neutrality. It's not, of course, not the answer that policymakers were hoping for. They were hoping to have a positive answer, lower benefits and higher earnings. And there were even calls for canceling the demonstration early on when it started to be apparent that this might be the case. But that, to my mind, was shooting the messenger because of the message. And we actually continued, SSA continued, and we finished the demonstration. We learned a lot from the offset. We confirmed, in fact, that it wasn't going to result in an increase in a reduction in benefits or earnings at that level. But I think importantly, the evaluation drew attention to reasons why the impacts of the bond offset were not larger, and those have already informed efforts to address the earnings and benefits of this population going forward. And we think that bond's lessons will continue to inform initiatives in the future, including lessons that we haven't even touched on here. So thank you very much. I'm turning it over to John Jones, our project officer, who we've been had the pleasure of working with for quite a few years now. John, please.
All right. Thank you, Dave. So, like Dave said, my name is John Jones. I've worked on the bond demonstration since 2010. I was actually the evaluation lead at Social Security Administration. So today, what I'm going to do is talk about a few things that you could take away. That's basically the last thing I'm going to talk about is the wrap up what you've understood today. But before that, I'd like to talk to you about two aspects that have yet to be mentioned in this presentation that we wouldn't have learned without conducting a demonstration or an experiment. And those are parking and did the benefit offset actually eliminate the cash cliff? And then later I'm going to talk about how bond help create a smoother path for the promoting opportunity demonstration that Dave has just mentioned. All right, but first let's go back and review. This is Danny Gubitz's graph that he presented. This is the standard representation of current SSDI rules. And what this shows you is that beneficiaries can earn to a certain amount of earnings. That earnings level is called substantial gainful activity. Once they earn above that amount, even if it's $1, they lose all of their benefits. Essentially, that's 100% tax on their benefits. So that's called a cash cliff. Right? And just to note, most beneficiaries in the DI program do not work. The vast majority earn nothing. They have zero recorded earnings. So that's something to remember. I'm going to actually refer to that in just a moment. Now, the benefit offset demonstration tests a 1-for-2 offset set at SGA. So essentially, it builds a ramp over the cliff, and that ramp has two parts. It has a top part of the ramp and a bottom part of the ramp. That bottom part of the ramp is where beneficiaries could earn so much that they have completely offset their benefit payments to zero. Danny Gubitz called that full offset. Now that ramp represents a 50% tax. That's what Bond was testing, is whether you replace the cash cliff with a ramp, and would that induce beneficiaries to go back to work. But let's focus at the top of the ramp for a moment. That brings up this issue about parking. Now this is a concept that's well written in the literature, that SGA rule that SSA has prevents beneficiaries from earning above that amount. In fact, they suggest that there are parkers, that is beneficiaries who will work, but they only earn enough where they won't go past SGA to avoid losing their benefits. Those are parkers. That's what we typically call them. So the idea is that SGA creates this disincentive to work. And one could argue that that's one of the driving forces for asking SSA to actually test the offset to see if that would eliminate parkers. Of course, there's other reasons as well. So under an offset, like we've tested in Bond, you would assume that that would be a benefit to parkers, that they would no longer suppress their earnings and would want to work more and essentially jump the cliff and get on the ramp. Well, what we find in the Bond evaluation report, which, by the way, I will put a link at the end of the slide so that you can access that yourself, we find that the majority of the beneficiaries induced to use the offset were not necessarily those parkers. Some did, but most of them were workers or were non-working beneficiaries. That is, beneficiaries that report zero earnings. That's an interesting finding that we would not have found had we not done this test. Also, if you wanted to phrase this in a lighthearted way, you could say that the 2-for-1 offset induced mostly non-beneficiary workers to jump the cliff to land on the ramp. All right? Now, the other concept I want to talk about is, did the benefit offset eliminate the cliff? And the answer is obviously no, it didn't. And the reason why is because the cash cliff represents 100% tax on benefit payments for any earnings above SGA. The Bond offset, the 1-for-2 offset, is a 50% tax. So it didn't eliminate the cliff, it just reduced the work disincentive that the SGA rule creates, but it didn't eliminate it. Now in the Bond final evaluation report, what we find is that beneficiaries who could actually earn enough to offset their benefit payments to zero, that is the other end of the ramp, the bottom of the ramp, we're finding that beneficiaries actually have a tendency to reduce their earnings. That is, they don't want their benefit payments to go to zero, or at least that's what the evidence would suggest. And so what that kind of tells us is that maybe that there's the offset has actually created a secondary cliff at the other end of the ramp, so that the Bond 1-for-2 benefit offset actually kind of discourages people to work so much to actually reduce their benefit payments to zero. That is also an interesting finding. By the way, that was actually noted in the design report, and that was not a surprise necessarily, but because so much attention is placed at the top of the ramp and this concept of parking and eliminating that I think that result is actually obscured. So it doesn't eliminate the cash cliff, and in fact, it makes a smaller one at the other end of the ramp. All right. I want to talk to you a little bit about smoothing the path for future demonstrations at SSA. All right, so if you don't know that the Social Security Administration gets its authority to conduct demonstrations to test changes to the DI program through Section 234 of the Social Security Act. Now that act has certain requirements, but one of the elements is it's time limited. The Bipartisan Budget Act of 2015 extended that authority to 2022 to conduct the Promoting Opportunity demonstration. Now, like Dave has already mentioned, that's a benefit offset test as well, but one in which the threshold that starts the offset, that is the top of the ramp, starts at a much lower level than SGA, and there's other subtleties to it. I won't go into it now because we don't have enough time. All right, but I want to talk to you about some considerations that we have to think about when we're conducting demonstrations. Bond was one of the largest demonstrations that the Social Security Administration has ever attempted. And with the size, that is, working with roughly 1.2 million beneficiaries, there's complications. And you can imagine within a large organization such as the Social Security Administration, it requires quite a bit of attention and resources to coordinate all the efforts necessary. And in particular, I want to draw attention to operations, systems, and mentioned about outreach. Operations is a large component within SSA that houses experts, technicians, and benefit specialists who look at DI records, that is the disability insurance records, and they adjust benefit payments based on the rules in the program. Systems is the computer operating environment created at SSA that allows beneficiaries to make those benefit changes. It also automatically changes benefit payments based on the program that it's used. Now, with Bond being so large, it required a system build that stood by itself away from the Social Security system to actually to adjust the benefit payments for the beneficiaries in the demonstration. Also, outreach. Outreach is very important, as Dave has brought to your attention, that what we are attempting to do with an experiment is to produce an artificial environment that would exist if the hypothetical benefit offset were a national demonstration. Now, we want beneficiaries who are assigned to the treatment group to experience the intervention as if it were under a national policy. Now, to pull that off requires an immense amount of outreach, one, to inform the beneficiaries they're in the demonstration, but also enough outreach to convince them that the demonstration is authentic, that the intervention is going to work as it's suggested, and it also requires coordination between operation systems as well. Those two major components within the Social Security Administration. The coordination between those two elements alone is quite difficult during periods of downturns in the economic environment, like recessions, when the business of SSA disability program increases. We have a lot of people applying for disability benefits, but during a period of economic downturns, when you have continuing continuing resolutions that really constrains the agency from actually hiring the personnel needed to handle that load, you have to make do with what you have. And so it requires careful coordination with those two elements, and made stronger during recessionary periods. Right? I've spent enough time on that slide, so I would like to now just to quickly sum up what you could take away from this entire presentation. There's a lot of information here. So if your head's swimming, I don't blame you, but let me just say, you should think about the demonstration as an experiment. It was designed to test a 2-for-1 offset. It wasn't a pre-step to implementing the offset as a policy. Congress actually wanted to know what would happen if they implemented a 1-for-2 offset. And so that's what we've done. We've tested it, and we've gotten results. And if you wanted to know the 3 main takeaways from the demonstration, I have them here. You could read them in the evaluation report that I'll give you the link to in the next slide. But the main point is that the benefit offset that we tested in bond did not encourage enough DI beneficiaries to go back to work to make it cost effective. What it did is made the DI program more generous in that it increased benefit payments, but at the expense of decreasing the DI trust fund, essentially transferring DI trust fund to working beneficiaries. And that worked in the cost-benefit analysis, showed that that was a net loss to taxpayers and to the society as a whole. And it also showed in the demonstration that if we gave more counseling, or that is enhanced counseling services, where the benefits counselors reached out to the beneficiaries and contacted them frequently, that it was no more effective than the much less expensive benefit counseling that we have currently in SSA. So those are the 3 main takeaways I think you can infer from the demonstration. You could read them in this report. It's on that link on the screen, the Bond Final Evaluation Report. Scroll roughly 3/4 of the way down the screen that you get when you activate that link, and you'll see the report there. And so you're welcome to read it yourself. So with that, I think I'm done with my presentation, so I'll hand the floor back over to the moderator, I think Dave Wittenberg.
Thanks, John. I appreciate everybody's presentation and keeping the time. We have approximately 13 minutes for questions and answers, and we have approximately 20 questions, so I'm going to try to move through these fairly quickly. The first question comes from Thomas Bowman at the University of Texas at Austin, and were there any groups most likely to benefit from the bond demonstration?
Yeah, this is Denise, who talked about stage 1, and in that presentation I did mention that we tested the offset among 7 different subgroups, and some of the rationale for testing those subgroups was because we did expect that some of them would be more likely to use the offset, and much so than their counterparts. In particular, we thought that beneficiaries with short duration, so those that had been on the rolls for 36 months or less, SSDI only, that is, we're not also receiving SSI, those who are employed at baseline, and younger beneficiaries would all be more likely to use the offset, and so we thought that there might be some differences there. We did not find any statistically significant differences, as I mentioned, and the difference between the treatment earnings and the control group earnings among those subgroups were quite small, just observationally as well.
Okay, thanks, Denise. Next question is coming from Barry Dellin, who was involved in the benefit offset pilots. And was there an effort to assess participant beliefs about how SSA would use the information about earnings above substantial gainful activity in the post-study CDRs? And similarly, was there an effort to assess beneficiary beliefs about the likelihood of significant overpayments or underpayments?
Yeah, there wasn't any formal assessment of what beneficiaries' beliefs are about how they might interact with the system or how that it might play out. But I am going to jump on this opportunity since there was a question about overpayments. For those of you who are not familiar, an overpayment is when Social Security pays a benefit to which the beneficiary is not entitled. So in the case of work, if a beneficiary was working and, for example, under current law, had earnings over SGA and shouldn't have received a benefit, but SSA maybe didn't know or process that information, and they paid the benefit anyway, SSA will ultimately learn that the beneficiary was working during that period and retroactively say, we shouldn't have paid you benefits, that was an overpayment, that money is owed back to Social Security. And beneficiaries do have options to request waivers or reconsiderations. But so that's the general idea of an overpayment. And in bond, we did find that overpayments were more likely, and this is somewhat related to the annual accounting period used in bond versus the monthly accounting period. But although overpayments were more likely among the bond treatment subjects, they had a lower overpayment amount than the control group subjects. And this is presumably because control group subjects, when they worked and were overpaid, they were overpaid the entire benefit amount. And for bond treatment subjects, they would have received a partial benefit amount. So the overpayment dollar value was less.
Thanks, Denise. The next question comes from Chris McLaughlin at the Department of Labor, and it's probably a question for you, Danny. In stage one, were there any periodic follow-ups to clear up the new benefit rules? Were there differential impacts among those that noted that they had a clear understanding of the new rules compared to those who did not?
So that's two parts. The first part, I think Denise covered the outreach to the stage one treatment beneficiaries to let them know that they were in the stage one treatment. There was initial a letter, and then after that there was a follow-up letter and up to 2 phone call attempts. So that was the effort to, and that was in subsequent years, to inform the stage one treatment members that they were in the stage one treatment. I think your second question was a kind of subgroup analysis. Do those who are better informed have different impacts than those who are worse informed? We didn't perform that analysis because there's an endogeneity issue there. That this is both those things happen after random assignment. Both the understanding of rules happen after random assignment, and the earnings happen after random assignment. So we don't have a good counterfactual in that case.
Thank you, Danny. So I'm going to go around the horn here a little bit with our presenters. Next question comes from Eric Friedman at Apt Associates, and questions for you, John, at SSA. Many beneficiaries actually remain eligible for the bond offset until 2022. Are there plans to update the bond evaluation findings based on a more complete picture of the offset over the entire demonstration period?
Well, what we have done is we've contracted with Apt to take care of the beneficiaries who will still continue in the demonstration until they've actually completed the demonstration at the end. I think it's 2021. The answer is yes, we are planning on looking at those beneficiaries and following them over time and observing their behavior. There will be reports. Probably most of them will be done in-house, but it's possible that we could actually contract out if we wanted to do a larger study. But right now, it looks like it's mostly going to be in-house work.
Thanks, John. The next question is for you, Judy, and it comes from Jennifer Rager at the Social Security Advisory Board, and it's in relation to EWIC service provision. Where were stage 2 beneficiaries referred for services, and how did those counselors ensure timely service provision?
Thank you. There's also another question about counseling that I might take the opportunity to answer. I might need to defer the part about where to Michelle Wood, but I do want to point out that both EWIC, the Enhanced Counseling, and WIC, the Work Incentives Counseling, offered to the treatment subjects in Stage 1, and that first treatment group in Stage 2 that was assigned to receive standard counseling. It was separate from the standard WIPA counseling. It was standard counseling for the treatment subjects in stage 1 was designed to mimic WIPA in the type and intensity of services provided. It was provided to subjects by counselors who have the same certification as CWICs, the only that is certified work incentives counselors. The only intended difference is in the content, with the bond-specific work incentives counseling describing the benefit offset work incentives rather than the current law work incentives. Related question about counseling was about counseling receipt among those assigned to standard counseling. So in stage 1, the year, in early years of the demonstration, as much as almost 3% of the treatment group subjects sought standard counseling, and that decreased to about 1% by the end of the demonstration. Probably in the first few years, more beneficiaries had questions about the offset rules that apply to them.
Thank you, Judy. The next question is for you, Dave Stapleton, and it comes from Peter Mead at Career Connect. And has anyone considered, and it's really a policy implication question, has anyone considered the possibility that the difficult process of applying for SSDI benefits defeats the credibility of SSA with beneficiaries, so that the low rate of understanding of the benefit scenarios is partly a matter of the challenge in the learning process?
Yeah, so I think that's certainly a possibility. I think more broadly there is great concern about how well beneficiaries trust or how much they distrust SSA, and exactly why or why not is unclear. Certainly the complexity of the current process, and I think somebody's mentioned that, under the current process we have long delays in benefit adjust often, as well as large overpayments, and that those sorts of things really undermine the trust among beneficiaries for SSA, and not really possible to consider the sources of distrust. But I think there's a sense that the beneficiaries don't trust SSA to administer their benefits correctly, and that reflects this sort of experience. And the same experience with the benefit determination process, where they may have been denied benefits early and then appeal later on and taken a very long time to get on the rolls. That same sort of experience seems likely to undermine trust, but there really hasn't been any specific research on that issue.
Yes, and so I want two last questions in 3 minutes remaining. The second to last one, I'm going to see if you can answer very quickly for Judy, Danny, or Denise. How did the recovery from the recession impact the study, and did it change the results over time?
So this is Danny. I think we saw some clear trends in the data in terms of levels, so that employment, as the economic recovery progressed, we saw more employment and we saw more earnings at higher levels. We don't think that affected the demonstration in the years that we looked at, because we were looking at impacts. We were looking at the differences between treatment groups and control groups. So the economy was affecting both groups equally. So that's basically the answer. We see some evidence of the economy in the levels, but we don't think in the impacts.
Danny, and there are several other questions here online that we definitely thank you for. That'll be part of the transcript. But I want to end on a series of questions that came in from Carrie Moran, from the Massachusetts Rehab Commission, Randall Cook, and these are questions really for SSA. And the question is, does SSA expect to make any changes to the SSDI benefit structure as a result of these findings, or implement any other changes as a result of the bond evaluation? If so, is there any timing of when those changes would occur?
Well, immediately, no changes at all. Now, the results will have to be communicated up through the chain of command. But as of now, I don't see that it's going to change DI policy now, and any change that would come about would have to actually be discussed among the executives. So it's actually beyond my capability of actually answering that question fully.
And I think that is probably a good way to end because we are right at the 1:30 mark. So I want to thank everybody for attending today's forum. We hope you enjoyed this discussion. And can you please let us know what you think how we did by completing the electronic survey, which is available to all webinar participants at the close of the session. Thank you very much and have a nice day.